Hi, my name is Inayaili, like Peter just said. I'm a product designer at a company called Make Us Proud, which is a product design studio based here in London, very near the beautiful Barbican. Right now, I'm working on a project with Joyent. Joyent are a San Francisco-based company. They're early contributors to Node.js, and they're pioneers in the fields of cloud computing and application virtualization. They're early adopters of software containerization technology. And before they were acquired by Samsung last year, they were the largest privately owned cloud provider in the world. So we are working with them on the new iteration of the My Joyent portal, which is also called Triton, which is an infrastructure management platform. And we want to bring application management into it, which will include things like deployment of services and versioning, alerting, and a lot more things. Before that, again, as Peter just kindly said, I used to work at Canonical, who are the company behind the Ubuntu operating system, for quite a long number of years. And there I was leading the design of the vanilla framework, which is used across all of the products at Canonical and all of the websites. So just some housekeeping before I begin. I am going to use the term design system throughout my talk because it's just easier to keep to one term. But that doesn't necessarily mean that when I'm saying that I'm referring to a very complex design system in the truest sense of that term, something that has tone of voice and brand guidelines and pattern libraries and all of that stuff. But it's just a lot easier to use, to say design system throughout the talk rather than call it very many different names. And for those of you that don't like that, I hope you can understand my reason and that you can forgive me for doing that. So the title of this talk is Keeping Your Design System Alive. And it was a bit inspired by the Tamagotchi, which was this cute little device in the late 90s. Did anyone here have a Tamagotchi? Ooh. So the Tamagotchi had this little animal inside that you had to look after and you had to play with, and you had to do several things and feed it to be able to keep it alive. But then I decided that I actually was not going to continue with that analogy any further because the Tamagotchis ended up being just incredibly annoying and completely useless, and I hope that your design system isn't that. Today, I'm also not going to tell you how you should create a design system from scratch. I'm going to assume that maybe you already have one or you're in the process of creating one. My goal is to give you some ideas, some tips on how you can make sure that once you do have one, it's properly maintained, and how you can encourage usage and participation from your team and from other teams, because I know that it's not easy at all to get the resources that you need to plan and to create a design system, but I think that it's even harder to keep it alive once you do. But if you do want to talk about how to get to this point, you can try to grab me later during the breaks, and I'll be happy to talk to you about that as well. Just one second. So tip number one is put someone in charge. So before you do anything else, make sure that there is someone that is leading the project. And you can call them a project lead, you can call them an evangelist, a champion, whatever you want to call this person or this group of people. Their responsibility is to keep the design system alive. And not just alive, but also healthy. If you don't have someone that is responsible, even if you really, really want to maintain a design system, it's just not going to happen. Everyone's always busy, and everyone has other things on their minds, and it's just incredibly easy for a project like this to go down and down and down on the priority list. Even though a design system can save teams just loads and loads of time in the future, people find it really hard to understand the need for this huge investment of time that is needed up front and then that is needed to maintain it. And finishing and delivering other stuff just tends to sound more important. So if you think that everyone's going to pitch in and everyone's going to drive this project just because you really want to, you should think again. So this person will be there to make sure that the project is prioritized and that you're working towards the goals that you've defined, which leads me nicely to my next point. By the way, everything that I'm referencing here will be linked to in the slides and in the slide notes. So even if it doesn't have a link here, it does somewhere else. Anyway, so tip number 2, have a roadmap. It's important that everyone working on this project shares a common vision. So you should start to think about where you'd like to be in 3 months, or where you'd like to be in 6 months, or in a year. And this shouldn't really be an overview of the tasks that you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you know, small things, bug fixes, things that you're actually working on right now. It's a more high-level view of what you want to focus on next. To get something like this started, you can just gather a few people in a room and you can get everyone to write down in different Post-it notes what they think are key goals for your design system. So they could be writing things like, we need to have a website, or we need to have a Twitter account, or social media presence, or we need to make sure that it's accessible, or, oh, sorry, I have an app to tell me when I need to have a break, and it just told me that I need a break. It might say it again in 5 minutes. Anyway, so it could be things like, we want to get 50% of the teams in the company to use it in 6 months, or we want to have better documentation, or we need to design primary and secondary buttons first, and so on. Once you have this list, once everyone is finished with this task, you can then start dividing things on the wall. Maybe you can divide things into sprints, or into months, or into quarters, or releases, or however you think fits the way you work best. This is the high-level roadmap that we created at Canonical for the vanilla framework. It's actually a public Trello board that anyone can go and see, because it's an open source project. Once you have something like this, you can then refer to it, to this prioritization regularly when you're planning the work. And it will make it easier to decide what tasks you want to be focusing on next. What's the most important thing that you should be doing next, and what is less important and you don't have to spend time on now. And these goals can change, and these goals should change. So you also need to remember to put in place some kind of mechanism, like regular meetings, that guarantee that you're going to keep checking these and updating these once in a while. Tip number 3 is be open. If you're working on a design system, I assume that your ultimate goal is to get people to buy into it and to use it. And I believe that this works better, and this actually happens if you include people in your vision and you share the plans of things that are to come, and if you're transparent about how new guidelines and components are added to your system. When you're working really hard on a design system, and the same for any kind of project, when you're working really hard, it can become really, really hard to listen to negative feedback. But it's very important to become a better listener and really try to understand any suggestions or any comments that people are making. Is this something that we really need to improve, or is this something that we need to think about adding? Because they're probably saying that for a reason, and those are the people that you want to use the design system. The target is probably not you. So what I mean is that it's important to accept other people's ideas and not just dismiss them straight away and think that they're wrong. So some more specific ideas. After you do the prioritization exercise that I just showed, maybe you can share it with everyone. You can open it up for feedback, and maybe you can change things if people have ideas of other things that you might have forgotten, and add more things to the list or reorganize things a little bit. You can also use tools that are more inclusive. So in the project that we're working on right now with Joyent, we just started using Figma instead of Sketch, so that anyone on Linux or Mac or Windows can see your design files, because it's a web-based app. So you don't have to have anything installed to see a file, to leave a comment on the file, to inspect the elements and see all the properties. Also have discussions in a place where people can keep track of them, like, for instance, GitHub. The Joyent project that we're working on right now is all available on GitHub publicly. But this doesn't mean that your projects have to be public. You can still be open within a restricted number of people. You can be open within your company. Make time for discussion, like having regular show and tells or regular critiques about new components that are open to more people, not just the design systems team. And you can also organize workshops to define and to name new components. Or maybe you can do things like mini sprints. So instead of a normal sprint that can be usually 2 weeks, you can have a mini sprint that's like 2 or 3 days, where a group of people that don't normally work on the system are trying to fix a bunch of issues or working on a specific theme. So you can say, in these 2 or 3 days, we're all going to work on typographic issues, or we're all going to try and fix any bugs related to performance. And this is a really nice way to get people that are not familiar with the system to know where things are in the code base. How do you write the documentation? Just be able to find things and make it a little bit less scary to contribute. And obviously, you should write about your work, either internally, like on something as simple as a mailing list, but preferably externally, like on a blog. If you're not the kind of person that is comfortable sharing work in progress, you might have to get out of your comfort zone a little bit. It's very likely that even people that aren't working directly with you on the project are going to be affected by it, and you want this to have a positive impact on their work. You don't want the design system that you're working on to just be another annoyance that they have to work around and that they have to deal with on their day-to-day. Tip number 4, define your contribution process. For me, a design system is never finished. Styles can change, new components are added, improvements have to be made to the code base. And even if you're not accepting contributions from a wider community, like some open source projects do, you might still want to think about defining the contribution process, even for people within your team. So at Canonical, we did a diagram that defines the thought process that should happen inside your head before you submit a proposal for a new component. And to get to this point, a small group of people, again, got together and we sketched a flow diagram on a whiteboard. Everyone gave their opinions. We erased things, put things back. And when we were done, we presented this diagram to a slightly larger group of people that were very invested in the system as well to get feedback. And we got lots and lots and lots of feedback from them. We had to revise lots of things that didn't make sense, and we added other things, and then we shared it with everyone else. And by doing this, it doesn't mean that now this process is set in stone. Actually, it has changed quite a few times. Just like the design system itself, just like the components themselves, all of these artifacts that you're creating around it, like the contribution process, diagram, and the roadmap before, all of these will evolve. So the team that is working on the Joyent project is quite small, but even in this case, we feel that it's necessary to have some guidelines on how the design system can be expanded from the initial set of components. You shouldn't just go into the code and add some new components without having some buy-in from the rest of the team. We want to make sure that a new component that is added or any new guideline that is added makes sense, not to just a very small set of people, and also that it follows some rules to maintain the consistency and the high quality across the system. And going through this process of thinking how you want the system to expand usually also brings up important conversations about the system's principles and the values and the standards that you want to maintain, which is key in keeping the consistency that you probably want from your system. Tip number 5, looking after your documentation. Again, even if only a small number of people are working with your design system, you want to define some parameters on how things should be used and how to put everything together into screens or into pages, and how people can propose new code or make any changes. And documentation can be brand guidelines or style guides. It can be browser support guidelines, accessibility guidelines, contribution guidelines, getting started documentation, coding standards, tone of voice. In a way, all of these documents are your design system. If you think that maintaining components is hard, I think that maintaining good documentation is much harder. But it's also crucial to maintain the consistency and the high standards that I'm sure that you want from your design system and for all of the websites that your teams are going to build when they use it. I don't really have any amazing insights on how to force people to write great documentation every time that they add something to the system, because I find this point particularly hard. So if you do, I would be happy to know. Something that you might want to try, maybe, is to have a column in your task board for documentation, so that every issue that is being worked on needs to go through that step to make it really visible. You could also consider adding documentation to the review process so that no pull requests can go through if there isn't well-written, sensible documentation around it. Also, test your documentation. So usually the people that write the docs are very close to the project, and they know which components are in the library by heart. They know how everything fits together. They know exactly what they should do and what they shouldn't do. So it's important that you let people who are not as familiar with the docs have the docs guide them through the design system and see where it lacks detail and where things could be explained better. Maybe you can do this as part of migrating existing sites to using the new system. So instead of the design systems team, if you have one, do the migrations, you can get people, or you can get a mix of people from the product team and the design systems team to do it together. And it's really invaluable feedback on the documentation to go through that process with someone that is not as familiar. Whatever you do, remember that your docs need to be clear and they need to be specific enough, but you don't want them necessarily to be authoritarian or dogmatic, or then you'll end up scaring people out of contributing and out of improving the system. I wonder when my app is going to tell me to stop again. It's probably soon. Tip number 6, make things easy to find. So all of these things that I mentioned so far can very easily, very quickly be spread around the internet without a proper central location. And if you expect people to follow all of these rules, then all of them should be very easy to find at the moment when people are working with the project or on the project. And ideally, everything should be in one location, some kind of central hub. This can be as simple as having, maybe it's an internal wiki, or it's a dedicated website, or it's the GitHub Pages site, or maybe it's just your GitHub repo README file. There's also several tools that let you create documentation fairly easily. As long as everything is within reach from one location and it's very visible and clear, so that you don't have anyone asking you where is the browser support documentation over and over again? Or where is the testing checklist? Or, oh, I did not do any accessibility assessment of this new pattern because I didn't even know that there were any guidelines. So you don't want this to happen, so make sure that everything is in one place. And my last tip is plan for maintenance. Again, a good design system is never really done. You don't get to just say, great, that project's now finished, it's released, let's move on to the next thing. New components are added, new guidelines are added, new technologies are going to have an impact on it. Maybe you want to add things like animation, or you want to improve the performance or the accessibility, or you want to improve the microcopy across all of your components, or maybe you need to start deprecating things that aren't useful anymore. It just never ends. And knowing about these things that need to happen, this doesn't happen by magic. For example, to know about new components that are needed, or to know that another team might be defining a new component that will be useful to your system, you need to talk to people. You need to have conversations. And these conversations don't just happen. I think the easiest way to make sure that they do happen is, again, to book some time in people's calendar. So I'm afraid that might mean a few more meetings. At Canonical, we had what we called a working group meeting to discuss new component proposals, to answer any questions, any concerns, and discuss ideas about things that could be improved in the process, not just about the components in specific. And this working group meeting happened every other week. The entire design team, including front-end and back-end developers, everyone was invited to these meetings as optional guests. Obviously, the core framework team had to be there. The conversations could go from, I think we need some more utility classes to deal with spacing, or when you add a field set in a row that has a dark background, the text color doesn't work. How can we fix that? Or maybe someone would say, we created this new accordion pattern for this other product, and we think it would be useful for the library. How you revise these proposals and evaluate them is something, if something needs to be added or needs to be changed, is up to you. But having this fixed time in everyone's calendar that is not cancelled at the last minute, even if some people can't attend, this was really important to us, and it worked extremely well, and everyone was always very excited about these meetings. Something else that we also did was we worked in regular 2-week sprints where we worked with epics. A normal epic could be something like implement the new vertical spacing. But also in every sprint, we had an epic that was just called Scheduled Maintenance Works. And I got that name from Transport for London, of course. Inside this epic, we could include just any random GitHub issue that we wanted to complete in that 2-week period. So it was like small things that didn't really merit their own epic. They weren't associated to any theme that we were working on at that time. And this also worked really well, and it gave us some flexibility to just keep fixing smaller things. So remember that even teams at large companies that you might think always do everything right, they change their minds, and they change the way that they do things midway through their projects because they learn new things. So you should always expect change, whether it's big or whether it's small. So to recap, make sure that you put someone in charge, have a roadmap, be open, define your contribution process, look very carefully after your documentation, make things very easy to find, and plan for maintenance. Design systems, as you can see, are a lot of work, but they're also a lot of fun. I hope that you can try at least a couple of these ideas in your own projects. I would love to talk to you about this more if you want to. I'm usually in the design systems Slack channel. I don't think it's called channel. It's workspace? work? Yeah. Anyway, I'm on it. A lot of other really cool design systems people, like Gina Ann and Nathan Curtis, they're always on it, answering lots of questions. It's really cool. So I'm there if you want to catch me, and I'm also on Twitter. Also, if you're looking for a new job, we're hiring designers and developers. So there you go. And those are all the links in GitHub for everything that I mentioned, including all the credits for the photos as well. And that's me.